The Feldwebel did not shout the order twice. He had learned, in 3 years of war, that you said a thing once and clearly, and if the man in front of you was alive and not deaf, he understood it and moved. So he said it once: "Find the second platoon. Tell them the left flank is open. Tell them to close it now." The runner nodded and went through the gap in the hedgerow at a low run, and then the gap was empty, and the Feldwebel turned back to the field. He had perhaps 4 minutes before the situation changed. He had perhaps 2 before it became critical. He had sent the runner because there was nothing else to send. What he did not know was that 20 meters away, on the other side of a hedgerow that neither man would have been able to see through, an American staff sergeant was already speaking. Not to the man beside him, not to anyone in the field. He was pressing a handset against the side of his face and speaking in a calm and level voice to a man he had never met, who was sitting behind a map 3 kilometers to the south. And that man was already moving his pencil. The Feldwebel waited for the runner to come back. The runner did not come back. 4 minutes after he had been sent, the world behind the German position came apart in a sound that had no beginning and no end, only a duration. And in the silence after it, the left flank was not a tactical problem anymore. It was not anything anymore. The Feldwebel had fought in France in 1940. He had fought in the Soviet Union. He had been a good soldier in both places, and the system he understood had made him effective. The system he understood was built on wire and voice and the legs of young men. It had worked. It had worked for long enough that no one who depended on it had seriously asked what would happen if the other side used something different. The German army that went to war in September 1939 was, by any honest measure, one of the most signals-capable forces in Europe at its upper levels. At corps, division and regiment, the Wehrmacht had invested seriously in radio communications, in trained operators, in doctrine that understood the relationship between information and tempo. The blitzkrieg that swept through Poland and then through France was not simply an armoured idea, it was a communications idea. Panzer commanders with radios in their tanks could coordinate across distances and at speeds that horse-mounted liaison officers could never match, and the armies they were cutting through, still organised around telephone lines and dispatch riders, could not respond to what was happening before it had already moved on. What that success produced, alongside justified confidence, was a particular blindness. The Wehrmacht's communications investment had been concentrated where it had mattered, which was at the operational level, among the commanders who directed formations across large distances. At the bottom of the structure, at company, platoon and squad level, the German army fought with the tools it had always used. Runners, signal flags, field telephones where wire could be laid and where it stayed intact. Occasionally a radio at company headquarters, the Torn, Fu, D2, or one of its variants, heavy and temperamental, operated by a trained specialist who was both a valuable asset and a significant logistical burden. This was not considered a deficiency. There were serious arguments against pushing radio communications further down the chain. A lieutenant who transmits his position in clear voice is a lieutenant whose position has been transmitted. Radio traffic could be intercepted. Direction-finding equipment could locate a transmitter within minutes of it broadcasting, and the tactical advantage gained by speaking quickly could be more than cancelled by the enemy knowing exactly where you were when you spoke. German signals doctrine at the small unit level treated silence as a form of discipline. You communicated when you had to. You used a runner because a runner did not broadcast. The system had a logic to it, and the logic had been tested. In the opening campaign in Poland, where German units moved faster than any army had moved in the previous war, runner-based coordination at the squad and platoon level had functioned adequately because the engagements were fluid, the initiative was German, and the time required to send a message and receive a response was not, in most cases, longer than the situation could sustain. The fighting around Bzura in September 1939, where German forces encircled a large Polish force attempting to break through to Warsaw, had involved exactly the kind of company and platoon-level coordination that the doctrine assumed runners could handle. It had worked. The Polish force was destroyed. What the doctrine had not been tested against in those early years was a situation in which the other side was also moving. A runner works well enough when you are attacking and the enemy is confused and the front is moving in your favor. A runner works considerably less well when both sides are trying to act simultaneously in the same few hundred meters of broken ground, and one side can communicate in seconds, and the other side is watching a man with a message disappear into a hedgerow and waiting to see if he comes back. The German signals officer who wrote a training assessment in the autumn of 1942, reviewing communications performance in the first years of the war, concluded that current practice at company level was sufficient for the tasks the infantry was being asked to perform. He was writing from the experience of 3 years in which those tasks had been largely offensive, in which German units had held the initiative, and in which the enemies they had faced had communicated no faster than they did. He was not wrong about what had happened. He was not thinking carefully enough about what was coming. The device that would rewrite the terms of that argument had its origins not in a military laboratory, but in a commercial one. Motorola, in the 1930s, had been building car radios. The company understood FM transmission, understood miniaturization as a practical engineering problem rather than a theoretical one. And when the United States Army Signal Corps began looking for a solution to battlefield voice communication at the small unit level, Motorola was positioned to answer the question in a way that the military's own development programs had not managed. The contract that followed produced 2 pieces of equipment that would, by 1944, be as common in American rifle units as the M1 Garand. The SCR 300 was a backpack radio, FM, capable of reliable 2-way voice communication at ranges between 1 and 3 miles, depending on terrain and atmospheric conditions. It weighed roughly 16 kilograms with batteries, which was not light, and the man who carried it carried that weight in addition to his own weapon and equipment, which was a significant ask. But the weight was the only serious objection. FM transmission, as opposed to the AM sets that most military forces had standardized on, was dramatically less susceptible to static, interference, and the particular chaos of radio noise that a battlefield generates when artillery is firing and vehicle engines are running and every metal object within a kilometer is vibrating. An AM transmission in those conditions was frequently unintelligible. The SCR 300 in the same conditions was clear. The Signal Corps officers who had pushed for FM over the objections of those who considered AM the proven standard had understood something important. A radio that could not be heard under fire was not a radio. It was a weight. The SCR 536 was a different instrument for a different problem. Where the SCR 300 was designed to connect companies to battalions and battalions to regiments, the SCR 536 was designed to fit inside a man's hand. It weighed under 2.5 kilograms. Its range was limited, half a mile in open terrain, less in the enclosed ground that American units would find in Normandy and the Pacific, but it did not need range. It needed to reach from one end of a platoon to the other, to let a squad leader on the left know what the squad leader on the right was seeing, to let a lieutenant at the back of a column know that the men at the front had stopped and why. It was not a strategic instrument. It was a tactical one, and tactical was where the gap was. The Signal Corps had understood by 1942 that the answer to small unit coordination was not a better runner. It was a device cheap enough, light enough, and reliable enough to be distributed in sufficient numbers that every small unit leader had one. The production numbers that resulted from that understanding were staggering by any comparison. By the time American forces were landing in Normandy in June 1944, the combined output of SCR 300 and SCR 536 sets ran to hundreds of thousands of units. The logistics chain that delivered ammunition and rations to the rifle companies also delivered batteries. The system was not perfect. Batteries failed. Sets were damaged. Operators were killed. But the system existed at a scale that absorbed those losses without ceasing to function, which is the only scale at which a system in a war is worth having. A German technical intelligence officer who examined a captured SCR 536 inches late 1943 wrote an assessment that has survived in the Steeple records. He noted the device's construction with what reads as genuine professional admiration. The FM approach, he wrote, was intelligent. The simplification of the operator interface was intelligent. The miniaturization of the power supply was a serious engineering achievement, and then he added the conclusion that made his assessment wrong in the way that mattered. Surely the Americans could not have produced these in sufficient numbers to reach below company level. The phrase he used implied something closer to incredulity than analysis. It was the conclusion of a man reasoning from his own production experience, from a system in which a radio was an expensive and carefully managed asset allocated to those who needed it most, and shared among those who could not each have one. He was applying a German logic to an American problem and arriving at a German answer. He was, as events would demonstrate, entirely mistaken. The first serious encounter between that mistaken assumption and the reality it had underestimated came in Sicily in the summer of 1943. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of the island that began in July, was the first large-scale American ground offensive in the European theatre, and it placed American and German forces in direct, sustained contact in terrain that offered the defender significant advantages: volcanic ground, narrow roads, hilltop positions with commanding views over the approaches. The German formations defending Sicily, principally the Hermann Göring Division and elements of the 15th Panzergrenadier Division, were experienced, competent, and confident in the defensive doctrine they had been applying on other fronts. That doctrine assumed a certain tempo of enemy action. It assumed that an attacking force, once engaged, would need time to assess what it was facing, communicate that assessment to higher command, and arrange a response. That time, in the German experience, was measured in tens of minutes, sometimes longer. At Troina, in the north of the island, the fighting ran for nearly a week through the first days of August, and the American after-action reporting from that engagement contains something worth reading carefully. American rifle companies, under fire on the approaches to the town, were calling artillery adjustments through SCR, 300 operators attached at company level, and those adjustments were reaching the fire direction centers and producing observed fire on German positions at a speed that the German defenders, reading the pattern of what was happening to them, could not account for by any observer placement they had been able to locate. Prisoner interrogation records from that period include statements that have a common shape. The Americans must have had someone very close, perhaps inside the position, because the shells came before any observer could have reported from the distances we could see. The conclusion was wrong. The observer was not inside the position. The observer was the man with the radio at the edge of the last covered approach, and the distance between that man's eyes and the artillery battery was irrelevant once he began to speak. A German company commander whose unit had held a ridge position east of Troina for 36 hours described the moment in a report that was captured later in the campaign. His position had been well chosen, he wrote. It commanded the approach, it had depth, it had been reinforced. The Americans had probed it twice and pulled back both times. On the third approach, artillery began to fall on the reverse slope, which was where his reserve section was positioned, which was a place no observer from the front could have seen. He sent a runner to check on the reserve section. While the runner was moving, the position on the forward slope was taken under fire from a different direction. He sent another runner to the platoon on his right to ask for support. When neither runner had returned after 20 minutes, he understood that something had changed in the nature of what he was facing, though he did not yet have the language to name it precisely. He was attempting to manage a situation that was moving in 3 directions at once, using a communications system that moved in one direction at a time. The Americans had looked at the same problem and built something else entirely, and the gap between the 2 approaches was being measured. That afternoon, in the distance between the ridge he had held for 36 hours and the ridge he was retreating from now. The hedgerow country of Normandy was, in the estimation of the German commanders, who had spent 4 years preparing to defend it, close to ideal ground for stopping an attacker with superior numbers and material. The bocage was not a landscape in any conventional military sense. It was a medieval inheritance. Centuries of Norman farming practice expressed in earth banks 2 meters high, topped with dense root systems and vegetation that had been growing since before any living soldier's grandfather was born. The fields they enclosed were small, the lanes between them sunken below the level of the banks, the sight lines measured in tens of meters rather than hundreds. Artillery could not see into it from outside it. Armor could not move freely through it. An attacker who tried to cross a bocage field under fire from the far bank was crossing open ground with no cover and nowhere to go, and the defender on the far bank had chosen his position, prepared it, and was invisible until he chose not to be. The German commanders had not been wrong about the terrain. They had been wrong about what the terrain could and could not prevent. What it could prevent was direct observation across distance. What it could not prevent was voice. American rifle companies that entered the bocage in the days and weeks after the Normandy landings of June 6, 1944, were fighting in conditions that reduced visibility to the point where a squad leader could not always see both ends of his own squad. Movement through a hedgerow gap meant exposure for the seconds it took to cross it, and those seconds were frequently the last seconds of the man who chose them. The tactical problem was not courage. American soldiers in the bocage had courage in the kind of quantities that terrain like that consumes very rapidly. The tactical problem was coordination. A unit that cannot see its adjacent elements cannot move with them. A unit that cannot move with its adjacent elements moves alone, and a unit that moves alone in the bocage moves into a position that the German defender has already accounted for. What the SCR 536 made possible, in those enclosed and brutal fields, was coordination that did not require sight. A squad leader on the left of a company front could tell the squad leader on the right what he was seeing without either man exposing himself to tell the other. A platoon lieutenant, 100 meters behind the forward element, could listen to both of them and make a decision based on what they were both reporting simultaneously, and then tell both of them what to do, and both of them would hear it at the same moment and begin moving at the same moment, which was a thing that had never been possible before in the history of men fighting in enclosed ground. The hedgerow did not disappear. The danger did not diminish, but the American units could behave, inside ground that should have made coordination impossible, as something closer to a single organism than a collection of isolated men making individual guesses about what the men beside them were doing. The 30th Infantry Division, fighting through the bocage towards Saint-Lô through the weeks of June and July, was engaged in some of the hardest fighting the American army experienced in the European theatre. German units defending those hedgerows were not second-line formations. They were veterans, many of them from the Eastern Front, fighting in terrain they had prepared and understood. The after-action reports from 30th Division units in that period document a pattern that repeats across dozens of engagements. American elements fixing a German position from the front while adjacent elements, guided by voice communication through their SCR 536 sets, moved through gaps on the flanks without the defending unit receiving warning until the flanking movement had already achieved its angle. The German response to a flanking threat was a runner to the adjacent position asking for support. By the time that runner had navigated a sunken lane and found the adjacent position and delivered the message, and the adjacent position had decided what to do about it, the flanking element had already moved again. A German platoon leader, whose unit defended a hedgerow position near Saint-Lô for 3 days in late June, wrote an account that was included in a divisional report captured later that, "Summer. The account is precise and bewildered in equal measure. The Americans," he wrote, "moved as if they could see through the hedgerows. They never attacked a position they had not already flanked. They never flanked a position without simultaneously holding it in place from the front." He had watched this happen 3 times from positions he had believed were adequately covered, and each time the sequence was the same: pressure from the front, silence from the flanks, then noise from the flanks, by which point the front no longer mattered. He had sent runners to his adjacent platoons before each of the 3 attacks. He did not know what had happened to the runners. He knew what had happened to his platoons. The artillery connection that the radio made possible was, in terms of raw destructive consequence, even more significant than the coordination it gave to infantry squads, because what it connected was not one man to another man, but one man's eyes to an almost unlimited weight of shells. The forward observer system that the American Army had developed and deployed by 1944 placed a trained officer or senior NCO with an SCR 300 at company level, sometimes at platoon level in critical situations, whose sole function was to look at the ground in front of the infantry and translate what he saw into fire missions. He did not carry a rifle as his primary instrument. He carried a handset, and what the handset connected him to was a fire direction center that was, in turn, connected to multiple batteries of artillery, and those batteries could be shifted from one mission to another in the time it took to transmit a grid reference and a correction. Signal Corps studies conducted after the war, comparing American artillery response times to equivalent German procedures, found that the gap in call-to-impact time between the two forces was not marginal. An American forward observer who identified a target, transmitted a fire mission, received the first round, and adjusted to effect could complete that sequence in under 10 minutes in normal conditions, sometimes significantly faster when the net was clear and the battery was already laid in the correct sector. German artillery procedure in the same period, dependent on wire communication to the battalion fire direction center, and in many cases requiring telephone relay through multiple points, ran to substantially longer times when wire was intact, and collapsed entirely when wire was cut, which Allied artillery and air attack ensured it frequently was. At Mortain in August of 1944, the German High Command launched what it believed would be a decisive armoured counterattack westward, aimed at cutting the American corridor that had broken out of the bocage and was beginning to move fast through open country. The attack had serious weight behind it. Multiple panzer divisions, genuine surprise in its opening hours, the possibility, if it succeeded, of isolating a significant portion of the American forces that had already pushed south. What it encountered, in the first hours and through the days that followed, was American forward observers on the high ground of Hill 317 with SCR 300 sets, calling missions onto columns of German armor moving through terrain they had believed they had chosen for its cover. The observers on that hill directed artillery and fighter bomber strikes continuously, adjusting fires in real time as the German formations shifted and probed for routes around what was destroying them. The counterattack did not succeed. The men on the hill with the radios had something to do with that. A German artillery officer whose battery was engaged at Mortain gave a prisoner account that the interrogating officer recorded in some detail. He described watching his battery position taken under observed fire, the rounds walking toward his guns in corrections of 50 meters, each correction arriving within 2 minutes of the last, the whole sequence from first round to his position becoming untenable, lasting less than 12 minutes. He had not yet received confirmation from his forward observers that his position had been located. He had wire to his forward observer post. The wire had been cut by the initial American bombardment that had opened the battle. He did not know it was cut, because the line was simply silent, and a silent telephone line in the middle of an artillery battle could mean many things. And the one it meant in this case was that he was fighting blind, while the man responsible for killing his battery could hear everything he needed to hear and say everything that needed to be said, without moving from where he stood. The same asymmetry that was destroying German units in the hedgerows of Normandy had been at work in the Pacific for 2 years, before an American soldier pressed a handset to his ear in a Norman field. The Imperial Japanese Army's communications doctrine had developed along lines that would have been recognizable to any German signals officer: wire at the forward positions where it could be laid and maintained, runners where it could not, radio concentrated at the regimental level and above, and a cultural disposition toward silence and concealment at the small unit level that reinforced the technical limitations and gave them the appearance of deliberate choice. The doctrine had worked well enough in the campaigns of 1937 through 1942, in China and Malaya and the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, against opponents who communicated no faster and often slower. What it had not been tested against, in those years of Japanese expansion, was an opponent who had decided that every man who led other men in combat needed a voice that could reach across distance without a runner's legs to carry it. Guadalcanal, where American and Japanese forces fought from August of 1942 through February of 1943, was the first sustained ground campaign in the Pacific in which that difference became operationally decisive. The island's terrain was, in its own way, as communication hostile as the Norman bocage. Dense jungle that reduced visibility to meters, ridgelines that channeled movement into predictable routes, a climate that degraded every piece of equipment that was not constantly maintained. The Marines, who landed in August and seized the partially completed airfield that became Henderson Field, were not fighting in conditions that made radio communication easy. They were fighting in conditions that made every other form of communication nearly impossible, which meant that radio communication, however imperfect, was the only kind that worked at any useful speed. The Lunga perimeter, the defensive line that Marine units held around Henderson Field through the months of Japanese counterattack, was coordinated through SCR 300 nets that connected battalion command posts to company positions and company positions to the naval gunfire support that sat offshore in the form of American warships. A Japanese infantry force attacking the Marine perimeter in the night battles of September and October 1942 was attacking into a defensive system that could speak to ships carrying guns that fired shells the size of a small automobile, and the men in those positions could direct that fire in the darkness, adjusting onto the sound and the muzzle flash of the attacking force, while the attacking force could not communicate with its own supporting arms any faster than a runner could move through jungle that both sides had been fighting in for weeks, and that neither side had mapped to any useful level of detail. A Japanese infantry officer whose battalion attacked the Marine perimeter on the Matanikau River in late October kept a diary that was recovered after his death in that engagement. The entry, written 2 days before the attack, noted that the Americans seemed to possess an awareness of Japanese movement that exceeded what any observation post could provide. They knew, he wrote, where units were before those units had fired. They knew when a force was concentrating before it had completed its concentration. He attributed this to American air observation, which was a reasonable guess and partly correct. What he had not accounted for was the radio net that connected every Marine position to every other Marine position, and allowed a sighting on one part of the perimeter to become an artillery mission on a different part of the perimeter encased. Less time than it took his runners to find their way through the dark between his companies. He was killed in the assault. His battalion did not reach the airfield. The pattern that Guadalcanal established repeated itself across the island campaigns that followed: Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. In each case, the Japanese defensive doctrine, which was sophisticated in its use of terrain and concealment, was operating at a tempo that the radio net consistently outpaced. The Americans could respond to what was happening faster than the Japanese could report that it was happening. And in the arithmetic of infantry combat, where the difference between acting and reacting is frequently the difference between winning and losing, that tempo gap compounded with every engagement into something that no amount of individual courage or prepared fortification could fully compensate for. The German High Command was not unaware that a problem existed. By the middle period of the war, by 1943 and into 44, the reports coming back from units that had encountered American forces in sustained close combat contained a recurring observation. The Americans coordinated at a speed that did not correspond to what runners and wire could explain. The prisoner interrogation reports from Sicily and Italy, the assessments from signals intelligence officers who had been monitoring American tactical radio traffic and drawing conclusions about the density of sets below battalion level, the accounts from German officers who had fought against American units in close terrain, all of it pointed in the same direction. The Americans had pushed voice communication further down their structure than any German doctrine had anticipated, and the tactical results were visible in every engagement. The Wehrmacht's response to this understanding was not nothing. Production of the Torn, Fu. The series of field radios, the standard German tactical set, was increased through the armaments programs of 1943 and into 44. Some redistribution of available sets toward company level was attempted, particularly in formations identified as likely to face American forces. Field telephone exchanges were extended, where wire-laying parties could work under fire to reach platoon positions that had previously depended entirely on runners. These were genuine efforts, made by a signals establishment that understood the problem and was attempting to address it with the resources it could obtain. The resources it could obtain were the constraint that made every effort insufficient. German armaments production in 1943 and 44 was fighting a prioritization battle that signals equipment was not winning. Tanks needed to replace tank losses. Artillery ammunition needed to replace what was being fired and captured. Aircraft, submarines, fuel, small arms, every category was in deficit, and the signals establishment was competing against deficits that the German High Command considered more immediately decisive. A panzer division without radios at company level was still a panzer division. A panzer division without tanks was something else. The choices made reflected a judgment about which deficits were existential, and signals equipment at the squad and platoon level was not judged existential in the way that armour and fuel were. Allied air interdiction made the production problem worse by making the distribution problem nearly unsolvable. Sets that were manufactured in German factories had to reach the forward units through a logistics chain that was being attacked continuously from the air, and sets that were damaged in transit were not sets that reached the companies that needed them. The training problem compounded the distribution problem. A radio is not useful in the hands of a soldier who has not been trained to operate it, and the rapid expansion of German ground forces and the attrition of experienced soldiers meant that the pool of trained signals operators was not growing at the rate the new doctrine required. The Wehrmacht that had gone to war in 1939 had been a professional force with time-served signals personnel throughout its structure. The Wehrmacht, defending France in 1944, was being asked to fight a communications-intensive battle with a signals capability that had not kept pace with either the scale of the fighting or the standard set by the work. Enemy it was fighting. A German regimental commander whose unit was caught in the Falaise pocket in the last weeks of August 1944 wrote an account of those days that was recovered after the war from the files of his corps headquarters. He described the afternoon when he understood that the runner routes to all three of his battalions had been cut, not the wire routes, which had been cut for days. The runner routes, the physical paths through which a man on foot could carry a message from his command post to the men he was responsible for commanding, had been closed by the encirclement, by American and Canadian and Polish forces pressing inward from every direction, and he was sitting in a farmhouse with a map and a headquarters staff and no means of reaching any unit under his command. He had 3 battalions. He did not know where any of them were. He did not know if any of them still existed as organized formations. He waited for a runner who did not come, and in the waiting was the entire distance between the army he had started the war in and the army the war had made of it. There is a temptation, when accounting for what the radio did to the nature of small unit combat in the Second World War, to describe it as an acceleration. The Americans could communicate faster, therefore they could act faster, therefore they won engagements that a slower force would have lost. This is true as far as it goes, and it does not go far enough. What the radio changed was not merely the speed of communication. It changed the level of the force at which decisions could be made and immediately acted upon, and it changed that level simultaneously across every echelon from the rifle squad to the corps headquarters, and the compounding effect of those changes operating together produced something that was qualitatively different from anything either side had experienced in the previous war or in the early years of this one. The concept has a name. In the military theory that was developed in the decades after the war, but the men who experienced it in the hedgerows and on the Pacific beaches did not have that name available to them. What they had was the experience of it, which was this: an American unit that observed something, decided what to do about it, and acted on that decision could complete all 3 stages of that sequence before a German unit at the same level had completed the first stage and begun to communicate it upward. By the time the German observer was an hour in which the American net was operating and the German runner system was failing to cover the same distances, and the ring tightened with each one. A German general who had commanded at corps level through the Normandy campaign gave an account in the years after the war, in which he reflected on the American small unit performance he had observed in captured documents and prisoner reports. He wrote that what had struck him most was not the firepower, which he had expected and which had been as devastating as anticipated. What had struck him was the confidence and initiative displayed by American units at the squad and platoon level, formations led by young men who had been soldiers for 2 or 3 years at most, who were fighting in their first or second campaign, and who were nevertheless making rapid, correct tactical decisions in conditions that should have produced paralysis. He had attributed this, in the moment, to some quality of the American character, to an independence of mind that the culture produced and the army had cultivated. He had written about it in those terms, in his reports at the time. Reading those reports after the war, he said, he could see that he had misunderstood the mechanism. The initiative he had observed was real. The confidence was real. but both of them were being sustained. In conditions where isolation breaks initiative and uncertainty destroys confidence, by the knowledge that no American soldier with a radio was ever entirely alone in what he was seeing. The voice in the handset was doing something that no amount of training and character could do unaided. It was keeping a young man connected to a larger picture in a situation designed to reduce his world to the few meters of ground he could see from where he was lying. The general had thought he was watching American character. He had been watching American character amplified by a piece of equipment he had not taken seriously enough, built in numbers he had not believed possible, distributed to men at a level of the force he had not thought it worth reaching. The men who made the radio system work paid for the privilege in the way that every advance in warfare is paid for, which is in the currency that does not depreciate. The Signal Corps soldiers who maintained the nets under fire, who replaced damaged sets in positions that were still being shelled, who laid wire and then went back to relay the wire when the wire was cut, who kept the batteries charged and the frequencies clear and the traffic moving through conditions that were actively hostile to all of those things, were not remembered in the same proportion as the men whose advances they made possible. The forward observers who climbed to positions with good line of sight, knowing that good line of sight worked in both directions, that any hill from which you could see the enemy was a hill from which the enemy could see you and had already calculated the range to, called their missions and adjusted their fires, and did not always come back from the hills they had chosen. The radio operators who ran with the assault elements, who could not put down the set to use their weapon, because the set was their weapon in the sense that mattered most, absorbed the particular attention that German soldiers quickly learned to give them, because a squad without its radio was a squad that had lost something more important than a rifle. And the runners went anyway. When the radio failed or was destroyed, or the operator was down, when the battery was dead, or the frequency was jammed, or the terrain swallowed the signal, they went because there was nothing else to send. They went because the message still needed to travel, and the legs of a young man invasion had become a report, and the report had become a decision, and the decision had become an order moving back down through the structure to the men who needed to execute it. The situation that had been observed no longer existed. The American unit had already moved. The American artillery had already fired. The flank the German commander had identified as vulnerable was no longer the flank the Americans were using, because the Americans had already found a different one and spoken to each other about it and gone through it while the runner was still running. This was not a German failure of courage or intelligence or tactical ability. The German army in 1944 contained some of the most capable small unit leaders in the history of warfare. Men who had spent years in conditions of extreme violence developing an instinct for ground and an understanding of what infantry could do in it that was, in individual terms, as good as anything the American army could produce. What those men lacked was not quality, it was connection. The brilliant platoon leader who saw an opportunity on his left flank and could not tell the platoon leader on his right flank what he saw, and could not tell the company commander what he intended to do about it, and could not find out whether the artillery that might support him was available or already committed elsewhere, was a capable man operating in isolation. Capability in isolation is a diminished thing. It does the best it can with what it can see, and what it can see is never enough. The operational consequences of that isolation accumulated through the summer of 1944 in ways that became visible at the largest scale. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Bocage launched at the end of July, succeeded in part because American commanders at every level could redirect their forces in real time as the breakthrough developed, shifting exploitation units toward gaps as those gaps appeared, adjusting the direction of the advance in response to what the men at the front were reporting through their radios in the moment they were reporting it. The speed of the breakout, the depth to which American armored columns penetrated before German forces could organize a coherent response, was not simply a product of American material superiority or German exhaustion. It was a product of a force that could see what was happening and speak about it and act on it faster than the force trying to stop it could understand that it was happening at all. The encirclements that followed, the Falaise pocket that destroyed the bulk of 2 German armies in France, had a communications dimension that is easy to overlook when accounting for what went wrong for the Germans in those weeks. A force that cannot coordinate its units in real time cannot conduct the kind of rapid, flexible, defensive repositioning that an encirclement demands. The units caught in the Falaise pocket were not simply outrun by American and British and Canadian and Polish forces closing the ring. They were outrun by a command system that could close the ring faster than the enclosed force could find the gap and communicate its location and organize a breakout through it. Every hour that passed were what was available. Some of them came back, some of them did not. All of them knew, by 1944, what it meant to be the slower system in a war that had decided tempo was everything. These stories cost something to live through. The men who pressed handsets against their faces in Norman hedgerows and on Pacific ridgelines, who climbed hills to see and be seen, who ran through gaps in the ground that neither side controlled, who kept the voice moving when everything around them was trying to stop it. They were spending something that could not be replaced, and did not ask to be compensated for the spending. What they bought with it was connection, the ability of one man to reach another man across the ground that separated them and say, "I am here, I can see this, here is what we should do." That sentence, in its 10,000 variations, changed the shape of the war. The cost of sending it was paid by people who understood that some things are worth the price and did not wait to be told twice. Remember them for that. Be part of that. I'll see you next time.